of the biggest loopholes in the Kyoto Protocol is that, of course, it provides no restrictions on developing countries on their emissions, rightfully so. However, a lot of banks and industries are taking advantage of that by essentially investing in energy-intensive industries in developing countries because they know there's no ceiling on emissions anytime soon. The World Bank has been investing heavily in fossil fuels, despite all of the evidence on climate change and how it's going to disproportionately affect the poorest. Their own studies, say not only are the poorest going to be worse off as a result of climate change, but their own extractive industries review revealed conclusively that the poorest are worse off as a result of fossil fuel investment, that they don't benefit from all of these oil and gas and coal extraction projects. In fact, in many cases they're being resettled by open pit mines and pipelines that are being laid through their land, and they don't see even the barest of benefits in the form of electricity or any sort of income generation as a result of this. In fact, in many cases they see more repression and more corruption in their governments as a result of all the money that flows into the extractive industries. So that's the first problem. Now the second problem is that the World Bank is not calculating the climate impact of their lending. Not only are they continuing to finance fossil fuels, but they aren't even looking at the overall climate impact before projects get approved, so that the board of directors, if you're going to at least give them a sense of the environmental impact, they can make an educated assessment. Like, this project is going to have a huge impact on the climate. Maybe the benefits outweigh the risks, but at least they should have that data. They don't have that data. We've been calling for it for quite some time. And because the World Bank doesn't assess their climate impact, no other financial institution does either, because they all look to the World Bank in the absence of any sort of international environmental organization. The World Bank is the only institution that is setting any sort of environmental standards for international financial institutions. And this includes private banks as well, because there's a cluster of banks that have signed on to what are called the Equator Principles, which they basically said, we will not, we will uphold these environmental standards, and they're basing them on the World Bank Group's own environmental standards. So if the World Bank were to begin to assess its climate impact, not only would this affect the World Bank, it would have a ripple effect. It would have a domino effect on all of the other financial institutions. Most all, over 90% have signed on to the Equator Principles. 90% of the banks that are engaged in project finance in developing countries. And all of the other development banks, from the Inter-American Development Bank to the African Development Bank to the Overseas Private Investment Corporation to the Export-Import Bank, they would all be forced to go along with the transparency around their greenhouse gas emissions too. So it's a very critical issue that we have been trying to raise, is that we don't have an accurate environmental impact assessment of all of these financial investments. And in many cases, they would not happen, these projects would not go forward without this finance. Take, for example, the Chad-Cameroon pipeline. That pipeline would never have been built but for World Bank finance. So I ask the question, if this project would not have gone forward but for World Bank finance, then you could call it, in climate terms, additional. In other words, without that additional source of revenue from the World Bank and risk insurance and all of the other added bonuses that came along with World Bank backing of that project would have not gone forward. Therefore, why shouldn't this be considered an additional contribution to the global climate burden? Why shouldn't we calculate those greenhouse gas emissions as some sort of debit that accrues in the bank's portfolio? There's even more reason to call for this, because the World Bank is now positioning itself to act as a broker internationally in the carbon market. So they're profiting from carbon credits, from buying and selling carbon credits, but they're not getting any sort of accounting that says, wait a minute, you have all of these carbon debits over here that you financed. How can you possibly call this a significant carbon credit until at the very least you count your carbon debits? Now, of course, this would have to work in a way that is sort of a mirror image of how the carbon market works, which is that the credits and debits would revert to the investors. They wouldn't accrue to the developing countries, because the developing countries, as I said earlier, don't have any ceiling on their greenhouse gas emissions. But if we had a debit scheme that was put in place, first of all, it would give us a sense of how overwhelmingly these financial institutions are invested in fossil fuels, and what a farce, frankly, carbon trading is between developed and developing countries, where you have no ceiling on emissions and a ceiling, and it's the biggest loophole in the Kyoto Protocol. I mean, carbon trading is a loophole itself, but this is a huge loophole that is being exploited for ridiculous profit and gain by the very industries that we need to get out of fossil fuels. The European emissions trading scheme, it's very clear that the main industries that profited as a result of that emissions trading scheme, the EU ETS is what it's called, were the coal industries, the nuclear industries, and that the actual profits went up, greenhouse gas emissions went up, and the consumer paid more. They made billions, these industries. Now, the same sort of thing is happening in the north-south trading. You're seeing HFC manufacturers. These are very potent global warming gases and also ozone-destroying chemicals, are getting bought off to destroy HFCs with almost $1 billion for one project that was shut down in China. This is encouraging more HFC manufacturers to spring up all over the place in order to get bought off to destroy the very things that they're making. I mean, you can see, anybody with a clear view of how people work, and they see an economic opportunity, they're going to pursue it. HFCs are a hot commodity. Okay, let's produce more HFCs so we can get paid to destroy them. Similarly with fly ash. It's a byproduct of coal combustion. You have all this fly ash. We don't know what to do with it here in this country. In India, they have very little land available for disposing of fly ash because there's so many people. So they've been dumping it in rivers, and it's been a big problem for many years. Well, all of a sudden, the World Bank comes along and says, wait a minute, there's gold in that fly ash. We can turn that fly ash into bricks, like the bricks that you make into houses, cinder blocks. Why? Because if you make cinder blocks out of fly ash, you don't have to actually fire them in a brick kiln the way you would clay. And because you don't have to fire them in a brick kiln, by the World Bank's bizarre logic, all of the greenhouse gas emissions that you would have emitted had you fired bricks using clay in a brick kiln are now for sale. And what signal is that sending to the coal-fired power producers? Not only am I going to get subsidies, as I always have for coal-fired power production, despite the enormous impact on the poorest as they're being resettled to make way for these just hellish open-pit mines. I've seen them. I mean, they're literally constantly on fire, and they're smoking and smoldering, and you're taking, forests that were once abundant with tigers and elephants and just mowing them down and putting in these open-pit coal mines. Not only are you doing that, you're now saying, there's money in that fly ash. Well, I thought we were trying to encourage India to move away from coal. Why then are we paying them for what should be a liability and turning it into an asset? It just is completely irrational. But that's the way the carbon market is working. And it's one reason why I've said, okay, at the very least, let's have a rational discussion about this. Let's talk about debits before we talk about credits. You want to get credits for your fly ash? Let's talk about all the debits that are, the carbon debits that are inherent in all of that coal that you are also financing and burning in the process. And then maybe we can have an accurate accounting, because the climate isn't going to be fooled by these accounting tricks. We're not going to all somehow miraculously escape global warming because of these accounting tricks. We have to be honest with ourselves and stop pretending. And so at the very least, a carbon debit mechanism would begin the process of an honest conversation about carbon credits. And so what I'm hoping is that we can raise this at the international level. I'm hoping to prepare a clear outline of how it would work before the Bali negotiations. I've already discussed it with members of the UNFCCC. They think it's a good idea. For some reason, nobody's thought of it so far. I think because nobody realized just how routine it is to do these kinds of investments without calculating their climate impact. We're working on Capitol Hill to try to get members of Congress to develop the methodology through the National Academy of Sciences to assess the climate impact of financial institutions, which are very different from states, because it's not point source emissions, it's emissions that will take place in the future. So it's a bit complicated, but not that complicated, and we can do it. We've got the capacity to do this assessment. The World Bank has been dragging their feet on it now and saying, well, we need 3 more years to figure out the methodology. I'm sorry, that's BS. We've run out of time. We've got maybe 8-9 years. We don't have 3 years for the World Bank to figure out what the climate impact of their lending is, and what all of the financial institutions that are profiting. They're going full speed ahead on the carbon market. They've developed methodologies for carbon credits. It should be just as quick and easy to do a methodology for carbon debits. And so that's the idea. Pretty straightforward. To understand the logic of the people that are proponents of carbon trading, you have to understand that there are two things at work. One is that they feel that the sulfur dioxide trading in the U.S. was a huge success, that we achieved gains in sulfur dioxide emissions trading that we wouldn't have achieved had we done this with regulation. And when you actually scratch beneath the surface, you realize that argument falls apart, because it was a lot slower than it was in countries that put in regulations on sulfur dioxide. But it was an experimental market. People were very excited that it seemed to work at all, without examining the successes and failures and how that would apply to a completely different gas, CO2, which is completely, far more difficult to both assess, because we're talking about CO2 from point sources that include fossil fuel combustion, deforestation, land use change, agriculture, all of the, cow farts, everything. How can you have a trading system that takes into account not only all of these sources of emissions, but oversees them, regulates them, make sure there's not leakage in the system, make sure there's not corruption, make sure that somebody who's pocketing money over here is actually doing what they say they're going to do? That's the first problem. And then the second problem is, even if you do this trading, at best you are at zero. In other words, you haven't emitted here, and you have emitted here, and therefore theoretically you're at zero. In addition, the theory behind carbon trading is that we will prime the pump now, and we'll go after the so-called low-hanging fruit, and industry will get on board, and then eventually the low-hanging fruit will disappear, and the price of carbon will go up, and eventually they will have to finance clean energy. Well, my question is, okay, if we accept that argument and forget about all the other arguments, eventually when? We have 8 years. Eventually, right now the price of carbon has plummeted because of all the problems. Investors don't have confidence in it. We need to get the subsidies out of the fossil fuel industry right now. Full stop. No more subsidies for fossil fuels. We need to ramp up those subsidies into clean energy right now. Carbon markets are not going to move fast enough. The bank's own studies say that carbon needs to get up to at least $100, over $50 a ton, $100 a ton for us to have even a level playing field for renewable energy globally. we're not there. We may not get there for another 5 or 10 years. We don't have that kind of time. Meanwhile, China has just said, hello, we're going to put $100 billion into renewables. Granted, some of it's for hydro and biofuels, and we don't like all of the, the fine print. But China single-handedly wants to invest $100 billion in renewable energy. Why is it that we need carbon markets when countries like China are willing to do this with their own money? And why can't we say this is an urgent enough problem? It's about the survival of our planet and thousands of species and our children and our grandchildren. We don't want to play around. It's not like we're talking about a huge impact on, the GNP either. Why can't we do this? Why do we have to trust the invisible hand of the market? Especially when the invisible hand, as evidence has shown, it keeps not leading us down the path we need to go. So I'm hoping that, Congress, the one good thing about the Bush administration not signing on to the Kyoto Protocol, and the others that have been dragging their feet, Australia and Canada sort of backtracking and saying they want to take a second look at carbon trading, I'm hoping that the good that will come out of that is that it will dismantle this idea that actually came out of the U.S., got embraced by the EU reluctantly, and now the EU is saying, well, we've done it, so you better join. I'm hoping that it will finally get us to realize, no, we need a solution that is about not transfer between corporations north and south, the same corporations that you want to move to a different energy system, but is actually about bringing clean energy, decentralized clean energy, and reforestation projects and afforestation projects to the people that need it the most and to the regions that need it the most as quickly as possible. And we can do that. We don't need carbon trading to do that. There's even the G8 in 2001 said we can deliver renewable energy to 1 billion people by 2010. Guess who said, no, sorry, we're not going to do that? Just take a guess. Yeah. Bush administration. Yeah, they were the only members after the Renewable Energy Task Force came out with this extensive study. Now, 5-6 years later, the Glen Eagles framework doesn't even breathe a word about renewables. And the World Bank is telling the world the only way we're going to provide energy for those 2 billion poor in the rural in the South is business as usual, nukes, so-called clean coal, carbon capture and storage, large hydro, carbon trading. Tiny fraction for renewables. Why the big change from 5 or 6 years ago? 2001, we could get 1 billion people by 2010. 2007, we're not even talking about it. And we're just talking about carbon trading. So I almost feel like we've gotten to a point of mental colonization, where we're the parameters of our discussion are markets. We've bought into this notion that somehow regulation doesn't work. We've bought into the notion that taxes can't work. We have to use the market. We have to plead with the elites of the world to save the world. And we don't have time to do that. We don't have time to wait and see if these markets are going to work. So.
When you say we only have 8 years, what are you basing that on?
Jim Hansen, some people call him the leading scientist on climate change in the world with NASA, and he has issued some very dire warnings about the tipping points that we are passing and will pass over the next 10 years. And his statement a year ago, I had him on my radio show, was we have maybe 10 years, if we're lucky, maybe less, to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. And some people say, even 2 degrees is 2 degrees centigrade, not Fahrenheit, is way too warm on average, because you'll see much higher in places like India and sub-Saharan Africa. You'll see much higher temperatures, and of course much more population density and water scarcity in those regions. The investments we make now in the infrastructure coming from institutions like the World Bank will affect the next 30 to 50 years of energy consumption for those developing countries throughout the world. And we're doing the exact opposite of what we need to do, and we're not calculating the climate impact. So if we take Hansen seriously, all of these institutions should get out of fossil fuels now. I mean, doing a climate impact, is in many ways sort of the very least. We know that fossil fuels cause climate change. In some ways, we shouldn't even be doing. We don't need to assess the climate impact. But if we're going to have carbon trading and not throw it out the window, and I suggest we do, at the very least, we should have an honest system of counting of carbon credits and debits. But the World Bank's own study said, get out of fossil fuels, full stop, by 2008. Oil by 2008, coal now. World Bank's own extractive industries review in 2004. They handpicked their own so-called eminent person, Emil Salim, who was on the board of a coal company in Indonesia, was the environment minister under Suharto, was a doddering, wonderful old man who really didn't believe that climate change was a problem, but after 3 years of hearing from government, industry, and NGOs about the impacts, both in terms of the impacts on the poor and on climate of fossil fuel investment, was thoroughly convinced the World Bank had no business investing in this. It was not benefiting the poor, and furthermore, it was destroying the planet. And their own study, which they said they were going to do because they wanted to get buy-in from their own people, they rejected. So that's where we are today, and the sooner people understand that it's not just about our subsidies at home, but all of the subsidies we're applying abroad, and how those subsidies need to stop yesterday, and that it is about following the money and getting the money in the right places, as well as regulation, the sooner we'll be able to tackle this problem.